How did one unarmed man help bankrupt the British Empire by making it unprofitable to rule? On the morning of 12 March 1930, along the dusty roads outside Sabarmati Ashram in Gujarat, a slight, bespectacled figure stepped forward with 78 followers. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. He carried no rifle, no map case, no rank insignia. Yet what began that day would shake the foundations of imperial rule across the Indian subcontinent and reverberate through the British treasury itself. By the late 1930s and into the crucible of the Second World War, Britain would discover that empire, once a source of wealth and manpower, had become a hemorrhage of resources. Police battalions, courts, prisons, railways, and administrators were stretched thin. Revenues collapsed. Legitimacy eroded. Little did they know that the strategy undermining them had been articulated plainly by Gandhi years earlier. Make it unprofitable. This is the story of how nonviolence became a weapon, how mass civil resistance imposed strategic costs, and how the British Empire found itself fighting an opponent it could not defeat nor afford to maintain. To understand the stakes, we must step back to 1915, when Gandhi returned to India after 2 decades in South Africa. Britain ruled India through the Raj, supported by the Indian Civil Service, the British Indian Army, and a vast network of police, tax collectors, and railways. The system extracted revenue through land taxes, monopolies, and tariffs, most notoriously the salt tax, while relying on Indian soldiers to police India and fight Britain's wars abroad. During the First World War, India had already contributed over 1 million troops and enormous material support. The price was high, and promises of reform went largely unmet. By 1919, the Rowlatt Acts extended wartime emergency powers into peacetime. On 13 April 1919, at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, British troops under Brigadier General Reginald Dyer fired into a trapped crowd, killing hundreds. The massacre shattered any remaining faith in imperial benevolence. Gandhi's response was not armed revolt, it was satyagraha, truth force, nonviolent resistance designed to expose injustice and impose costs without firing a shot. The objective was not to defeat British forces in battle, but to paralyze the machinery of empire. Courts clogged with cases, prisons overflowing, tax revenues collapsing, and the moral authority of British rule eroding in the eyes of the world. By the late 1920s, Britain governed India with roughly 60,000 British troops, supported by the Indian Army and police. On paper, this looked formidable. In reality, it was a brittle system dependent on compliance. Gandhi understood this. What happened next would become legendary. By 1929, the global economy was sliding into depression. Sterling was under pressure. Colonial revenues mattered more than ever. It was at this moment that Gandhi chose salt, a basic necessity taxed by the state, as the lever to pry open imperial control. On 12 March 1930, Gandhi set out on foot toward the Arabian Sea. Over 240 miles, villages emptied to see him pass. By 6 April, at Dandi, he bent down, lifted a pinch of natural salt, and broke the law. Across India, millions followed. Salt pans were seized. Illegal salt was made and sold. The British responded with arrests. Over 60,000 people detained within months. The costs mounted rapidly. Police units were redeployed from routine duties to crowd control. Courts overwhelmed. Prisons exceeded capacity. Revenues from salt taxes plummeted. International newspapers carried images of unarmed protesters beaten by lathi-wielding police, refusing to strike back. The moral balance shifted. By the late 1930s, Britain negotiated. The Gandhi-Irwin Pact released prisoners and suspended civil disobedience in exchange for talks. Independence did not come, but the lesson was clear. Non-cooperation could force concessions at a fraction of the cost of rebellion. Then came the storm of the Second World War. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany and unilaterally committed India without consulting Indian leaders. The strategic value of India skyrocketed.
skyrocketed overnight. Indian industry supplied munitions. Indian troops, eventually over 2.5 million volunteers, the largest volunteer force in history, fought from North Africa to Burma, but the price was catastrophic. Wartime inflation soared, food shortages worsened. In 1943, the Bengal famine killed an estimated 3 million people. Trust collapsed. By the 1942, with Japanese forces at the gates of India after the fall of Singapore and the advance into Burma, Gandhi and the Indian National Congress launched the Quit India movement. The demand was blunt: British withdrawal. By the morning of 9th August 1942, the British struck first. Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and the entire Congress leadership were arrested. The Raj unleashed emergency powers. Rail lines were sabotaged, telegraph wires cut, police stations attacked, not by armies, but by masses. For the British, this was a nightmare. At the very moment they needed India stable to fight Japan, they faced nationwide disruption. Troops meant for the front were diverted to internal security. The financial drain accelerated. By 1943, Britain was stretched to the breaking point. The war in Europe consumed men, steel, fuel, and gold. The defense of India required hundreds of thousands of troops, extensive policing, censorship, and intelligence operations. Every train was guarded, every port watched, every factory monitored. The numbers told a brutal story. Britain financed the war in India largely through sterling balances, essentially IOUs to India that ballooned to billions of pounds by war's end. India was no longer paying for empire. Britain was borrowing from it. Inside India, repression carried its own costs.
Detention camps, trials, censorship bureaus. Each act of coercion demanded manpower and money. Each beating was photographed, each arrest reported abroad. American opinion, crucial to Britain's survival, grew increasingly hostile to colonial rule. For Indian soldiers, the contradiction was unbearable. They fought fascism overseas while their families faced repression at home. Desertions rose in some units. Loyalty, once assumed, had to be constantly reinforced. By 1945, Britain emerged victorious, but exhausted. Its cities were bombed, its economy shattered, its debt immense. The empire that had once funded British power now threatened to bankrupt it. And then came the final shock. In February 1946, ratings of the Royal Indian Navy mutinied in Bombay, soon spreading to Karachi, Calcutta, and beyond. Ships were seized, British officers disarmed. The tricolor flew from masts. Though quickly suppressed, the message was unmistakable. The foundations of imperial control, obedience, and legitimacy were crumbling. The crisis was total. Britain could no longer rely on force without risking full-scale collapse. The cost of staying had become greater than the cost of leaving. The turning point was not a battle, it was a calculation. In 1947, the new Labour government under Clement Attlee reviewed Britain's position. The figures were stark. Maintaining control over India required massive military deployments, constant emergency powers, and endless financial outlays. The Indian Army itself could no longer be assumed loyal in all circumstances. Gandhi's strategy had worked precisely as intended. By mobilizing millions to withdraw cooperation, refusing taxes, boycotting goods, clogging courts, filling prisons, he had transformed empire from an asset into a liability. There was no decisive engagement, no surrender ceremony, just an admission of reality. On 15 August 1947, British rule in India ended. Against impossible odds, without firing a shot, a colonized people had forced the world's greatest empire to concede defeat. The triumph was incomplete. Partition brought horrific violence and the loss of over 1 million lives, but the imperial era was over. Gandhi himself did not celebrate. He fasted and prayed as bloodshed engulfed the land.
Yet his method had altered the course of history. The legacy of making it unprofitable reshaped the post-war world. Britain's withdrawal from India accelerated decolonization across Asia and Africa. The lesson was studied by movements from Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States to Nelson Mandela in South Africa. No medals were pinned to Gandhi's chest. No victory parade marched in his honor. But the balance sheet told the story. Empire had failed because it could no longer pay its way, financially, morally, or politically. For the British Empire, India had been the crown jewel. When it fell away, the imperial system could not survive intact. For the men and women who marched, boycotted, and endured prison, the cost was immense. But their determination proved that power does not always flow from the barrel of a gun. Sometimes it collapses under the weight of its own expense. Little did they know that a simple idea, refused to cooperate, would change the world. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WW2 Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.